With the peace deal hanging by a thread, what are the real prospects for a solution? Joining us to talk about that is William Courtney. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, a global policy think tank, and he's also a former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan. Welcome back to the show. We always bring you on when we've been talking about this conflict that's been going on for months now. Let's start with what's taking place in Paris. These four leaders coming up with something to agree on. But the real question is, how does it all get implemented on the ground?
The question right now that the Russians have taken Debaltseve, which at the time of the Minsk II agreements, everyone knew that the Russians had almost surrounded Debaltseve and would take it, but the Ukrainians kept fighting for some additional days. But now that that's done, the next question is whether Russia will engage in a really open violation of Minsk II, perhaps, and try to seize Mariupol, a city that's almost 20 times larger than Debaltseve. If Russia were to do that, then the debate in the West about supplying lethal arms to Ukraine would end. There would be lethal arms, and there would be a large-scale, what's called training and equipping program. What the British have announced today is a non-lethal, small-scale training and equipping program. So the threshold is right now with Mariupol. Will the Russians try to take it or not?
What happens if they do?
If they do, there will be a potential for a large-scale humanitarian tragedy there on a scale far different than we've seen in any of the fighting in Ukraine thus far. So this will cause concern. And then secondly, the West will then have to recognize that Russia's aggression in Ukraine could go even further, could go down to Odessa, the third largest city in Ukraine. So it would be a real transformational event.
What do you think is taking place? To the outside world, what is taking place, though, when you have these talks in Minsk, you have these talks in Paris taking place right now? There already was an agreement, but now there's fine-tuning, or are they putting more pressure on? What's taking place?
Well, the negotiations at Minsk II were really one-sided. Before they took place, the Europeans said, we're not going to supply lethal arms to Ukraine. Well, that undercut Poroshenko. Then he had no negotiating leverage. He had to agree to something that was very one-sided. Now the Europeans are trying to say, we're going to apply more sanctions to Russia if Russia furthers aggression. Not so much for Debaltseve, but if they go further than that. In Paris, I think they're thinking hard about what kinds of sanctions. Probably additional financial institutions in Russia would be hit. Whether the West would try to remove Russia from the SWIFT international payment system, which would be a kind of a nuclear option in the economic sense. It probably won't go that far in the West, but they probably will hit more financial institutions.
What is Russia's thinking, or what? Let's talk about the Russian perspective for a moment, because we had President Vladimir Putin come out recently saying that, going to war with Ukraine would be apocalyptic, and he's urging everyone to come back to this Minsk II agreement. It sounds like he's saying all the right things, but what do we read into what's happening on the ground, and how do you get people on the ground to listen to what these political leaders are saying?
Well, the Russians for some time have said things. For example, they respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, yet Russian aggression has suggested that in fact they don't. So it's hard really to take seriously anything that President Putin or other Russian leaders say. As President Reagan once said to President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, trust but verify. That's the mode that the West is in right now.
What are the prospects for peace? We've been talking about this for months, and we always want to look ahead. Where do things stand? Where are things going? Do you think things are further apart than they've ever been at this point, or do you think they're making some progress here?
With the seizure of Debaltseve by the Russians, they're at a threshold point. For the Russians, going after taking on Mariupol would be a much bigger task, would require more personnel and weaponry than they've employed thus far. They have well-trained special forces and airborne, but limited numbers, in the thousands. If they were to try to take on Mariupol, plus hold the other territory, they're probably going to have to bring in additional forces. For the Russians, the humanitarian tragedy, bringing in additional forces, polls in Russia have shown that going to war against Ukraine is unpopular still. And that's why the Russian leaders have been lying to their people, saying they're not fighting in Ukraine. That's why they've been trying to hide the deaths, the burials of Russian soldiers. But if they go after Mariupol, it's going to have to be much more open. It's a big threshold event.
All right, we'll have to see what happens there. William Courtney, as always, we appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you.